at Arnsberg was attacked by Lancaster's Bomber Command, using 6 22,000-pound bombs. This viaduct was one of the 3 main ways of escape out of the Ruhr left to the Germans, and so the attack was clearly related to that carried out on March 14 at Bielefeld. Pictures taken after the attack show that 2 spans of this viaduct were smashed, and a direct hit was scored on the mouth of the tunnel into which the railway runs at one end. On April 7, 15 Lancaster's Bomber Command attacked a ship at Moiden, which the Germans were preparing to sink in order to block the approaches to the port. 12,000-pound bombs were used, and the attack was completely successful. April 9, 2 attacks on Hamburg were carried out simultaneously by Bomber Command, one on the submarine pens and the second on oil installations. 5 penetrations of the submarine pens were obtained, and very severe damage was done to the oil installations. On April 18, nearly 1,000 aircraft of Bomber Command, escorted by Mustangs and Spitfires of Fighter Command, made a heavy and concentrated attack on the naval base and fortress island of Heligoland, whose guns guarded the approaches to Hamburg and Bremen. An airfield on the island of Duna, 3/4 of a mile away, was also attacked and saturated with bombs. In these attacks, every gun but one was put out of action. And on the following day, a small force of 19 bombers made a further attack with 12,000 and 22,000-pound bombs, and this one gun was then effectively silenced. On April the 25th, 1945, Bomber Command carried out its last heavy attack of the war on Berchtesgaden, Hitler's retreat in Bavaria. The 3 targets were Hitler's chalet, the SS Barracks and Defense Control Center, and the famous Eagle's Nest. In spite of strong defences, direct hits were observed on the chalet. Bombing was very concentrated in the whole target area, with smoke rising to 10,000 feet, and severe damage was done to all the targets.
The battle for Berlin began on Saturday, the 21st of April, 1945. Marshal Zhukov, the general who never lost a battle, entered the suburbs of Berlin. The next day, the Russians captured the Weissensee district, and Hitler decided that he must stay in Berlin against all the odds. By April the 26th, the Soviets had ringed Berlin, while American and Russian troops finally linked up on the Elbe River to the west of the German capital. At 3:30 on the afternoon of the 30th, Hitler and his new wife committed suicide in the Führen bunker beneath the Chancellery and were then cremated in the garden, while the Russian artillery bombarded the building, with the advancing infantry only 2 blocks away. Goebbels and his family suffered a similar fate the next day. The Nazi regime had nothing left, with the capital of Germany reduced to rubble. Hitler's chancellery was destroyed. Germany surrendered on May the 8th, 1945. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich was no more. On August the 6th, 1945, the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, an explosion which changed the course of world history. With the Japanese surrender on August the 14th, the Second World Conflict in the 20th century was over. American warships entered Tokyo Bay. The greatest war the world had ever known became history. At least 60 million people had died. By the end of the Second World War, the Royal Air Force had entered the jet age with the Meteor and the Vampire. The next target was to be the sound barrier. It was also reasoned that Britain should have its own atomic bomb or nuclear deterrent, as the Western world was already witnessing the beginning of a Cold War with its old ally, Russia. All hopes that Europe would experience a lasting peace were shattered on the 24th of June 1948, when the Soviet Union finally brought all surface communication into a divided Berlin to a grinding halt. This was against all international agreements, which had cut Germany into 4 sectors or zones: British, American, Russian, and French. Berlin was divided into 4 equivalent sectors. They also guaranteed certain lines of communication between western sectors of the city across the Soviet zone of Germany. The West had proposed that Germany should become an integrated member of a European community in time. But Russia viewed a united Germany as a threat to its security, and a Western enclave situated bang in the middle of the Soviet zone was a constant reminder to those living under the Soviet regime that the West offered a very different way of life. War with Russia was unthinkable, but the West's Berlin garrisons had to be supplied. The alternative was that Russia would swallow up Berlin, which was equally unthinkable. So began the biggest airlift of supplies the world has ever seen.
Night and day, week after week, it was a case of more planes, more food, more raw materials, shipped without pause from 8 different airfields in the Western Zone. Month after month, the tempo of flights was stepped up, and by Christmas, American and British planes had made 100,000 trips and carried a total of 730,000 tons into Berlin. Even cars were transported. But coal, equally as vital to Berlin as bread, was the greatest load of all. Over 1 million tons have now been flown in. Hundreds of planes of all types and sizes, military and civil, were pressed into service. The RAF York load 9 tons. The Halifax over 6 tons. The Viking over 3 tons. The RAF Dakota 3 tons. The Civil Tudor 8 tons. And what the Berliners call the Grosser Tudor 10 tons. As an additional boost to the airlift, the RAF introduced its Hastings, each carrying over 9 tons. At the 3 airports in Berlin, Gatow, Tempelhof and Tegel, aircraft were landing or taking off every 90 seconds. Many notabilities visited Berlin to see the workings of this magnificent achievement and to praise the great work of the British and American ground and air personnel. Chief of the Air Staff, Lord Tedder. And the Foreign Secretary, Mr. Bevin, whose diplomacy was much aided by the success of the airlift. He added his tribute when he visited Berlin on the eve of the lifting of the blockade in May 1949. For 10 whole months, a ceaseless stream of Allied aircraft landed in Berlin, where Germans, supervised by British Army personnel, eagerly unloaded the vital supplies. Air crews of the RAF and Commonwealth crews from Australia, New Zealand and South Africa, together with their British charter colleagues, all of them played their part with the United States Air Force in maintaining this non-stop operation.
The blockade of Berlin was finally lifted on the 12th of May, 1949. For some 30 years, there had been considerable communist activity in Malaya. The country was well suited to guerrilla activity, with a central backbone of mountains rising to over 7,000 feet and millions of square miles of thick jungle. By 1948, the Malayan Communist Party had prepared a 3-pronged program of subversion. The first stage was to terrorize the rural areas, the second to establish local administrations, and the third was to declare Malaya a communist republic. The counter-strategy was to harass the terrorists in their jungle hideouts using the army, assisted by the RAF in a number of roles: reconnaissance, offensive air action, and air transport support, which included supply dropping, troop lifting, and the evacuation of casualties. Dropping supplies was found to be hazardous, as the terrain offered very few clearings for the Dakotas. Most were only holes in the jungle canopy of some 20 yards across. On the fighter front, 1953 saw the introduction of the Vampire, which proved well suited to the Malayan environment. Back in London on the 2nd of June 1953, the supreme head of the armed forces was being crowned Queen Elizabeth II.
But there were other memorable events which deserve their place in the record of royal occasions of 1953. The Royal Air Force mustered a vast array of men and aircraft for its coronation review at Odium Airfield in Hampshire. The Queen was accompanied by her husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, in his uniform as Marshal of the Royal Air Force. She was attended by the Secretary of State for Air, Lord Delisle and Dudley. It was the first royal review of the RAF since King George V's Silver Jubilee. Though a few of the men present were on parade for inspection by the Queen's grandfather in 1935, the spirit and the bearing were the same. The review of 1,100 officers, airmen and airwomen occupied the morning, and during a pause for luncheon, 300 or more aircraft representing all RAF commands were made ready for royal inspection. This static display was most impressive. In order to view the machines massed in such quantity and variety, Her Majesty and the Duke entered their car to drive along the lines. At several points, the Queen stopped to talk with officers in command of squadrons and to make a closer scrutiny of various aspects of this unique display. It was a 5-mile tour that lasted a full hour. Then they entered their car again to drive back to the saluting base. For the Queen, delighted as she was by all she had seen, there was still the thrill of the great flypast to come. A Sycamore helicopter led the actual parade, which had called for the biggest and the most intricate RAF organization there had ever been. From dozens of stations all over the country, aircraft of all commands, these are training command varsities, converged on Odium, and one can well imagine the split-second timing that was necessary. Now troop-carrying Valettas fly over. As squadron after squadron arrived, the speed of the flypast mounted. Meteors now a fighter command. They were followed by the famous Canberra bombers. And Sabre jets with their swept-back wings, manned by pilots of the Royal Canadian Air Force. Then came Swifts, with which the RAF was about to be equipped. The very latest in jet bombers, the Victor was there, making its first public appearance, an aircraft of strange and menacing design. And Lincoln's a bomber command.
The new Lincoln bombers were introduced into the Malayan conflict in the reconnaissance role in 1953. More significant in April 1950 was the arrival of the RAF's first operational helicopters, the 3 Westland Dragonflies of the casualty evacuation flight. Before this, the venerable Oster was used wherever possible to evacuate casualties. Now it had a new role, which was to lead the Dragonflies to their targets. 1955 saw the introduction of the larger Westland Whirlwind, which was disappointing as a troop carrier. By 1956, the terrorists were beginning to surrender. The emergency officially ended in July 1960. For the mopping up operation, the RAF brought in the Hawker Hunter, and the Meteors were replaced by Gloucester Javelins. A new emergency began in 1962 with rebellions in the British Protectorate of Borneo. This time, the RAF was well prepared. By the end of the 40s, it was clear to the Western world that the Soviet Union was in no mood for peace. So on the 4th of April 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was signed, which was to come into effect on the 24th of August. Now the world was divided by 2 huge security pacts: NATO for the West and the Warsaw Pact, which encompassed most of the communist world, led by the Soviet Union. It was clear that the RAF had to keep up with any threat from the communist bloc. The atomic age had arrived. Britain had to have an atomic deterrent and a bomber force to deliver it. The Canberra had proved to be an effective bomber, but couldn't carry atomic bombs. Britain's designers had been hard at work developing a nuclear bomb and a V-force of bombers to deliver it into the Soviet heartland. The first of the V-bombers arrived at Gaydon early in 1955. It was the Vickers Valiant, together with the Blue Danube plutonium bomb. The first Vulcan B Mark I squadron was formed at RAF Waddington in May 1957, and 2 Victor squadrons were formed in 1958 at Cottesmore. During the same year, Britain tested her nuclear deterrent near Malden Island. A Valiant, based at Christmas Island, successfully dropped Britain's first megaton hydrogen bomb, and the meteorological effects were monitored by Roy Chadwick's last masterpiece, the Avro Shackleton. By 1959, the RAF recognized that any bomber force had a very short time to get into the air, should the Soviet bloc launch ballistic missiles against Europe. That time was a mere 3 minutes. Conventional starts meant that the V-bombers took 4 minutes. So a program was introduced that meant all 4 engines could be started together. This reduced the reaction time to 2 minutes. Bomber Command also instigated low-level attacks by its aircraft to get under enemy radar. There was another question. What would happen if all major airfields were wiped out in a first attack, and what aircraft could be used for a second strike? There was a need for a low-level strike-attacking bomber with short-field operating performance. TSR-2 was that aircraft. Between 1959 and 1964, budgets were being savagely cut, and with the election of a Labour government in 1964, the TSR-2 project was relegated to the scrap heap. The NATO early warning radar station at Fylingdales was put under RAF command. It could give 4 minutes warning of even a missile attack. American Thor missiles were lent to the RAF to augment Britain's nuclear power. Meanwhile, Blue Steel was developed. It was dropped from a V-bomber and had a range of 100 miles. Then Britain was promised the American Skybolt with a range of 1,000 miles, but Skybolt was cancelled by the United States. Instead, Britain was offered Polaris. So after 12 years, Britain's deterrent was handed over to the Royal Navy. In-flight refueling had long been a requirement in the RAF. During the early 60s, a number of Victors were converted to that role. In June 1961, 4 of them helped a Vulcan fly from Scampton in Lincolnshire to Sydney non-stop. As far back as 1957, politicians were convinced that the future of warfare would depend on surface-to-air missiles, so that by 1965, the RAF had lost some 60 frontline fighters. One fighter that did survive was the English Electric Lightning. The Lightning was the RAF's first supersonic fighter with speeds over Mach 2 in level flight and a highly sophisticated radar system that could lock itself onto its target and bring the pilot into firing range. By 1967, all Fighter Command frontline aircraft were equipped with in-flight refueling probes. And by the end of 1969, Lightnings were being flown to the Far East with only 1 ground refueling stop on the way.
Roger, left-hand engine start switch on now.
In 1964, yet another British aircraft was abandoned. It was the P-1154 V-STOL fighter from Hawkers. The government of the day decided on the American McDonnell Phantom, which entered squadron service in 1969. But the threat from Russia meant that Britain needed an airborne early warning system. The Shackleton filled this role. It also pioneered a system to control the fighters and guide them onto their targets. By the late 60s, the RAF was looking for a replacement for the Shackleton. The answer came from Hawker Siddeley in the form of Nimrod, which was basically a radical development of the Comet, which was used to great effect in Transport Command. Nimrod was introduced into the service in the latter part of 1970.
Nimrod. In biblical times, Nimrod was a mighty hunter. It's a fitting name today for the most advanced maritime aeroplane in the world. A submarine hunter-killer and maritime reconnaissance aircraft, the Nimrod is replacing the Shackleton in the Royal Air Force Strike Command. The nerve center of this extremely sophisticated aircraft is not the flight deck, but the central operations room. A high degree of automation and computing is used for its sensor and navigational systems.
Digital computing system on. On.
Its high speed enables Nimrod to arrive at a search area in less than half the time required by a Shackleton. Therefore, submarine escape time is reduced and the area to be searched is cut down.
Roger. Check now from Sonics Coordinator. We're standing by for the drop. Roger, 9 miles. Roger.
ECM racket classified as possible submarine radar.
Day and night, in all weathers, from an operational height of more than 30,000 feet, Nimrod can detect, identify and locate surface or submerged vessels.
Because of financial restrictions, there were only 4 squadrons with 6 aircraft apiece, so the Shackleton still survived in tandem. The strike attack role was taken over by the Blackburn Buccaneer, which was another aircraft that was to stand the test of time. From the end of the Second War, the RAF had to base a large proportion of its forces in Germany to protect Europe from the Soviet threat. In the early 70s, Germany's NATO bases saw a number of improvements with the arrival of the Phantom FGR Mark IIs, which replaced the aging Canberras. They also saw the introduction of the Harrier V-Style aircraft. Number 25, SAM Squadron, was deployed to Germany equipped with the Bloodhound Mark II surface-to-air missile. Later in the 70s, Jaguars replaced Phantoms of number 14, 17 and 31 squadrons, and in 1977 they replaced the Lightnings of 19 and 92 squadrons. Although Britain lost many of its dependents and bases in the 70s, Cyprus was still important to the RAF, with a mighty force.
A force designed to serve, to watch and ward. Daily a multitude of different duties. Yet here the means to supply, survey, refuel, reconnoiter, strike, intercept or transport. Hundreds of tons of aircraft and many different types. Countless missions, roles, tasks and takeoffs.
Takeoff time. 18, import steady.
Follow speeding.
9, continue, 1 rolling.
79, continue.
Nine with green, you get along with the fish, it's on well on the left-hand side, the wind up, the bind up. After takeoff, check. Then again. Up indicated. Flat. Up. Correction. 50%.
This then is a service. A service that must be vigilant, mobile, and above all else, airborne.
Get on. Green on. Start to shoot release. Note on.
But for every one man in the sky, there are some 40 on the ground, keeping him there.
972 and the circuit clear.
These people, performing their varied duties, form the very backbone of the entire organization, blending their respective skills to shape a giant team. A team in which every player is vital and every day brings a fresh crop of challenges.
Airspace near Britain also had to be defended around the clock 365 days and nights a year.
One unidentified aircraft coming away North Cape at the moment. Alert, Southern QRA.
QRA, Quick Reaction Alert. Five times a week, on average, an RAF fighter is scrambled on a quick reaction alert. Mission: to intercept and escort any unidentified aircraft which threatens our airspace.
03, cockpit readiness.
Scramble.
03, scrambling.
Roger, Sierra 3.
I'm looking level on radar. Nothing yet.
Starboard 360. Target 015 at 30,000.
03, Roger.
03, an airborne early warning aircraft in your sector is monitoring the situation.
03, Roger. I think I've got in contact at 10 right, level.
Intercept unidentified.
03, identify 1 Badger, heading 180.
Shadow.
03, shadowing.
Target's turning away. You're clear to return to base.
03, returning to base.
Roger, 03.
From the 60s, the RAF were perfecting yet another role.
Flying combat troops and their equipment into a theatre of operations and then providing them with all forms of air support needed to finish the job. This is the primary task of Air Support Command. Getting them there is the job of the strategic force. Local air support is supplied by the tactical elements. Using its VC-10s, Britannias and Belfasts, aircraft normally kept busy on routine flights overseas, the Air Force is always ready to implement contingency plans at very short notice and rush troops to trouble spots anywhere in the world. Well, that's the strategic role. Ground forces of the Army successfully deployed into the theatre of operation. But a strategic airlift of this magnitude can only conveniently be deployed into the larger airfields, which normally are to be found well to the rear of the actual fighting. Therefore, it's the job of the heavy tactical aircraft, such as the Hercules, to uplift the troops, their weapons and supplies further forward to as near the battle zone as is practicable. Almost certainly, this will involve using unsophisticated and even unprepared landing strips as airheads. The Hercules aircraft was designed to operate on the sort of rough terrain in which many of these forward landing strips are likely to be found. Once these aircraft have reached their forward landing limits, troops and materials can be parachuted or ferried by helicopter closer to the front line.
On the 2nd of April, 1982, Argentinian forces landed on the British protectorate of the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic. The Argentine claimed the islands as their own, never thinking that Britain, some 8,000 miles away, would call its bluff. The Falklands conflict was the biggest test for the RAF since the Second World War. The first of the South Atlantic Task Force left Portsmouth in southern England on the 5th of April, 1982. The RAF's roles were strike, surveillance support and SAR operations using Vulcans, which were actually due for the scrap heap, Harriers, Nimrods, Hercules, VC-10s, Victors and Sea King helicopters to ensure that the task force ran the Argentinians out of the Falklands. One of the most audacious raids ever mounted in the history of aviation began at 11 p.m. on the night of the 30th of April when 2 Vulcans took off from the Ascension Islands accompanied by 2 Victor tankers and headed for Port Stanley Airfield on the Falkland Islands. One of the Vulcans failed to pressurize, so the second continued on its 16-hour flight to the target. Operation Black Buck was well underway. After its 5th airborne refueling, the Vulcan dropped to 250 feet above the ocean for the last 300 miles. Then it pulled up to 10,000 feet before dropping 21 1,000-pound bombs bang on the runway at Port Stanley. But it was the Harriers of both the Navy and the RAF that received their baptism of fire during that war. The RAF had flown their GR3s from England via the Ascension Islands to the Falklands, refueling in the air as they went. On May the 1st, a Navy Sea Harrier flown by an RAF officer, Flight Lieutenant Paul Barton, shot down an Argentine Mirage with his Sidewinder missiles. Harrier was at war, and it destroyed 20 enemy aircraft, while 9 Harriers were downed, none by Argentine aircraft. Out to sea, the greatest danger was from the French-made Super Étendard carrying the sea-skimming Exocet missile. One got through and decimated the Atlantic conveyor. Operation Corporate came to its conclusion with the surrender of the Argentinian forces on the 14th of June 1982. The RAF, yet again, proved that air support is absolutely essential in any modern war, however far away you are from home. As the Falklands conflict came to an end, the RAF received the first of its Panavia Tornadoes, the GR Mark I. This multi-role combat aircraft was an international project between Germany, Belgium, Canada, the Netherlands, Italy and Great Britain. It has variable geometry wings. It's fitted with terrain-following radar, which means that it can fly at ultra-low level and very high speed in any weather, day or night. And it hits its target right on the button. Tornado, just as the Phantom before it, had to protect Britain's shores 24 hours a day. But in the modern world, the backup for the pilot has had to become more and more sophisticated.
4,000 feet. Roger. 025, 55, left right heading 180, 4,000 feet.
Got contact, keep talking.
Target's descending. 030, 35, displace right heading 180.
Flying, looks accelerating.
Roger, target's indicating 250 feet.
Roger.
035, 25.
Roger.
040, 10, displace right heading 180, 250 feet.
Visual, 1 o'clock, pair low.
Do hard starboard 180, target heading.
Turning.
0702.
Roger.
Crossing left right.
Closing guns. Target's turning. Turn all right, go. Target's pretty high. Fox 3. Climbing. Fox 3. Complete.
Today's airborne battles will be fought at or near supersonic speeds. The pilots and navigators that fly these aircraft depend on the experience and expertise of their fighter controllers to guide them safely and successfully onto their targets.
Complete acknowledged. Return to camp, vector 250.
These are the RAF's battle managers. The radar information that flows into this operations room gives a picture of the position of every civilian and military aircraft in the sector. This information comes in first to these recognition officers.
When you do get an unidentified track, you can never be totally sure what the aircraft is going to do next.
Their job is to know the identity of every aircraft that comes into their area from its radar response, known as a track. Any aircraft that cannot be identified and does not respond to interrogation, they pass up the line to their boss, a track production officer, for a wider assessment.
Can you get the AW buffer man, please? We've got AW operations.
I'd never be able to find another job like this one. You've got to be decisive. It's not a job everyone's capable of.
The AWACS to move 50 miles further north.
If the aircraft still remains unidentified, the information must be passed on up to the master controller. It's down to him then to decide on a course of action. He's the kingpin. He's the battle manager.
Toad's got that up to date, will you? I run the battle. I decide what action to take and when. Down here in the operations room, we've got a complete and up-to-date picture of all the activity in the United Kingdom Air Defence Network. It's 100% accurate to the second.
If the master controller decides to intercept, he'll pass the order down to his fighter allocator, who will rapidly assess the status of the aircraft available to him to combat the threat.
The fighter cab Foxtrot Lima for Boomer Fighter Stud 197. Scramble, scramble, scramble. It's like playing three-dimensional chess with pieces moving at speeds of up to 500 miles an hour.
The fighter allocator will deploy what aircraft he considers necessary for the mission, then hand over control to one of his intercept controllers. It's they who will finally guide the fighters onto their targets.
1 and 2 on channel.
Hello, I've got Magic 63 calling. He would like a brief tourist asking.
The recognition officers are directly responsible to their track production officer. They monitor all the track data coming in from several recognition officers.
Proceed to area UK 33. It's my job to put the whole picture together. Below flight level 200, speed above 3. I have to ensure that accurate and up-to-date information is coming in at all times. Also, that there's no duplication of data or gaps in the radar coverage. If I do detect a gap, it's my job to fill it, and fast, using airborne early warning aircraft, air defence capable ships, or by relocating a mobile radar unit. Do you copy? Over. These radar units are commanded by a track production officer, who is responsible for the safety and administration of the convoy, as well as ensuring that the best possible radar picture is provided for the area. You really have to be able to think well ahead and manage both the technical and the operational side of the radar. Soon after I arrived at RAF Bulmer, I met some of the pilots on 202 Search and Rescue Squadron. They share the same station as us. They persuaded me to help them out occasionally at weekends, to give them some valuable practice winching me out of the North Sea.
The track production officer relays all the relevant data from the recognition side through to the master controller.
Alpha Lima being detected by the ship. This is the hot seat, right at the heart of things. During exercises or war, I run the short-term battle plan.
The fighter allocator, probably a flight lieutenant, is responsible for assigning controllers their targets. In peacetime, he coordinates the flying program for the fighter squadrons in his sector. Once the fighter allocator has chosen his aircraft and made contact, he hands over control to his intercept controllers.
Rooster 2, target port 340. Rooster 1, starboard 1. My task is to direct the intercepting fighters onto the target so that it can be first identified and, if necessary, destroyed. I'm responsible for the safety of both crew and aircraft. In peacetime, I look after something like 40 practice intercepts a month. I work very closely with and rely on my assistants. Controllable flight level 245.
Apart from the RAF's fighter intercept ability, heavy reliance for our air defence is put on our Bloodhound surface-to-air, or SAM, missiles. The officer in command of surface-to-air operations is known as the engagement controller. The post will be filled by an officer from the system side of the branch. He's responsible for the missiles, the launchers, the launch control post, and the day-to-day management of the section. He works through his control and reporting centre, but he's often got to act on his own initiative. In a war, it will be down to his command to fire the missiles.
Good lookout to the east and the southeast.
Fighter controllers have now begun flying duties with the airborne early warning mission crews on the RAF's E3 aircraft.
SC1, TD, net 3. TD, SC1.
Of the 17-man crew, 9 will be fighter controllers.
Status.
DD Link Manager, IGIMS and DRV established with Bulmer and Neatishead.
4 times a year, the RAF takes part in full-scale NATO exercises.
Strength 2, no squawk.
Got that, thank you. The battle manager must keep ahead of the game. Allocator, Razor 1 and 2 to New Combat Air Patrol, Juliet Whiskey Foxtrot.
Jane, move Razor 1 and 2 to New Combat Air Patrol, Juliet Whiskey Foxtrot. You've got to think ahead. Get your aircraft airborne before they get you. 2, heading south at 4,000 feet. Mission intercept, engage.
Razor 1 and 2, snap 030. 2 targets 02565, heading south.
Roger, Razor.
02560. Left right heading 180 4000.
Roger.
02040. 02030. Display right heading 180. Target's descending.
Good contact. Keep talking.
Target's level 250 feet, descend 1,000. Hard starboard 180. 102. South 1.
Roger. Closing guns. Target's turning. Go. Target's pulling high. Fox 3. Complete.
When it works, well, we all know we've got it right. Roger, complete acknowledged. Return to camp, vector 250.
All these skills were soon to be needed in the Gulf War, and Tornado was to prove itself in combat far sooner than anyone could have imagined, because the Iraqi army invaded Kuwait on the 2nd of August 1990. Saddam Hussein angered the world to such a degree that an international task force was sent into the region to counter the Iraqi aggression, after a request from Kuwait. Jaguar was used as a tank buster during the desert conflict. They were based at Al-Marak as they were prepared for battle. RAF Tornadoes were used in their capacity as long-range bombers to knock out Iraqi airfields and pinpoint targets. The Buccaneer, again due for retirement, also came out of mothballs to lead the Tornadoes onto their targets. Out to sea, Harriers arrived in style for their second war in a decade, while Sea Kings were brought in to detect mines in the Gulf itself. They were also on standby in their role as rescue aircraft. On the 17th of January 1991, Tornadoes took off for their first real sortie into enemy territory with all the most modern equipment on hand. Long hours went by, deep into the night, as the crews waited for the Tornadoes to return.
Suddenly, at last, flickering lights in the distant dawn, the first formation of Tornadoes was safely back. The young British pilots had flown deep into the heart of Iraq to attack military airfields and other targets, low-level flying to slip under enemy radar, dodging missiles and anti-aircraft flak, catching the Iraqis by surprise in this first encounter of an aerial microchip war. When the pilots had radioed back, mission successful, there was unrestrained joy in the command's operations centre. And as the aircrew wearily left the cramped cockpit of their planes, there were congratulations for the pilots and navigators who had braved the unknown and returned safely to tell about the fear and tension of it all.
Absolutely terrifying. There's no word for it. You're frightened of failure, you're frightened of dying. Oh, it's everything. You're flying as low as you dare, high enough to get the weapons off, but you push it as low as you can over the target just to get away as fast as you can.
Successful though the attack may have been in paralysing Iraq's air force, albeit temporarily perhaps, the state of readiness is not being relaxed. Ever since the bombing blitz, the Tornado pilots have remained keyed up and ready to go into action.
Well, they've come back, they've reported the firing of missiles, explosions, lots of ground fire coming from Kuwait. They've been able to see that from the air. It was obviously a very busy night in Kuwait.
Even as Allied pilots waited for their next mission, another chemical attack alarm. Ground crews quickly donning their gas masks once again, but no panic in what has now become a well-drilled task in reaching the safety of the bomb-proof bunkers, though this time it was no exercise. Pilots and navigators fully protected in their nuclear, biological and chemical suits arriving for a final briefing.
Although the huge task force returned Kuwait to its rightful owners, the Gulf War was a war that nobody really won. But the RAF, as it had done so many times before, did its job with precision and flair. But that flair doesn't just happen. RAF pilot training has always been of the highest caliber, from the Tutor to the Tiger Moth and the Miles Magister, to the more advanced Harvard for fighter command during those dark days of the Second World War, to the men and women of the Air Transport Auxiliary who ferried anything, anywhere. and then the faithful Anson, used to train Bomber Command's crews to learn at least the rudiments of getting accurately from A to B to drop their lethal loads on the enemy from the Blenheim or the Wellington, and later the Lancaster or the Vulcan. Throughout the history of flying, the practitioner has always wanted to show the aircraft to an adoring crowd. In the 30s, it was Northolt or Hendon where the curious mingled to behold the wonders of power and space. From the amphibious to the bomber, even seasoned pilots always watch and wonder at the ingenuity of these craft of the air. But surely it's the art of the aerobat that will always capture man's imagination, from the string and sealing wax of the biplane era to the sleek sophistication of the jet age. The Royal Air Force has always recognized its debt to its shareholders, the great British public, by making sure that they have a chance to witness some of the greatest aviators in the world. In the 50s and 60s, 111 Squadron, the Black Arrows, made their mark in history. No less than 16 Hunters rolled in unison. Followed by 22 aircraft in a perfect loop. The Red Pelicans from the Central Flying School dazzled an international crowd when they joined forces with the Nats that made up a new formation team, the Yellow Jacks. Those Yellow Nats from No. 4 Flying Training School at RAF Valley changed their name and the colour of their aircraft to become the world-famous Red Arrows. As time and technology took over, Strike Command's Hawks replaced the aging Nats. What is the future for the Royal Air Force? As in the past 75 years, mistakes will be made. But surely if the next 75 years are as dynamic and innovative, Britain will still have an Air Force of which it can be truly proud.